I believe I'm ready now.
Oh, okay, so yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present Jacob White.
Thank you, everyone. As you just heard, I'm Jacob White, and today I'm going to be talking about how to design games as games. Now, it's a little bit of background. I've been a fan of video games for basically my whole life, and I've been developing games as a hobby for about half of my life. So this is something very close to me, and as I look at the video game industry, I notice that there are some inefficiencies that I think could be improved. So with my Capstone project, I set out with a couple of goals. I wanted to, first of all, examine the game development process and achieve a deeper understanding of it. As I said, I've made games as a hobby, but they've typically been smaller and made on a shorter time frame, so I wanted to have a deeper understanding of the actual process. Then I wanted to demonstrate a different approach than what is typical in the modern day in the AAA game industry. And I want to evaluate that approach after I had made a game. So first I'm going to talk about that modern approach. As marketing has grown to be more and more important in attracting people to a game, there's been a push for more and more cinematic content to be put into trailers to draw people's eyeballs, because everyone wants a fun, exciting trailer to get hyped for a game. So that cinematic content either has to be made separate from the game and goes only into the trailer and is not present in the game, or it's also present in the game and is not spent only on the trailer. And that's the second of those is more common because developers and publishers don't want to waste the time of making something that's not going into the final product. But as a result of that more cinematic content, there is also a need to have a larger story presence in the game to support that cinematic content. And with that comes a larger focus on the story itself. And with that comes less time and budget dedicated to the actual game and the gameplay mechanics. So the problem I see here is that the industry is focusing on the wrong things. They are making games as if they were movies, with focus on the presentation of the story and the story itself instead of how the player interacts with the game. And because of this, I feel that a lot of time and money are wasted, spent on things that do not constitute a core solid product, but instead are the presentation of that product. As a result of that, I think development is a lot riskier than it needs to be. If a studio runs out of money, but they've got a fantastic story and a lot of great effects, but no actual gameplay, they can't ship that. It's going to be a failure. So I have a couple examples here. And you can see these budgets of these games which were released between 2011 and 2014 have budgets ranging from $30 million to $140 million. And now in each of these, in the games, there are a very large story presence. It's not to say that these are bad games. That's not to say that these are wasted potential. But there is a great deal of story presence and time that is not spent by the player interacting with the game. So I am proposing a different approach, and it may seem simple, but that is to build the game first. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean prototyping. Take a core idea, just a small piece of what will be the final game, build that, and then continually iterate on that to find the fun. This is going to be the actual core of the game that the story and everything else will be built around. So it's important to get that right, and this means that prototypes should be small and lean and can be thrown away without worry. So iterate on the prototypes, make the game fun to play and interact with, and not just fun to watch. And as a fun little bonus, by doing this and keeping the gameplay in mind, the story and the gameplay can be integrated in some very interesting ways that would not be possible if you were trying to attach a gameplay mechanic to a story which had already been developed and designed. So I made a game for this project, as I said, and it's a board game similar to chess or shogi, But instead of one player taking a turn and then another player taking a turn and going back and forth, both players decide what moves they want to happen, and then the turns happen at the same time. So the goal is not exactly the same as either chess or shogi. The goal is to destroy all the opponent's pieces, or failing that, to occupy their king's starting space for a set number of turns. So here's a screenshot of that. You've got the board over here, and then the controls on the right, and then down toward the bottom you can see where the moves will be queued. And I'll have a demo of that in just a moment. But I want to talk about the process I went through to develop this game. So I began with a very small set of the logic, and I created the board and the pieces. I wanted to get something small and playable as soon as possible. So I created the board and the pieces, and then I added how the pieces move and made all that logic. Then I added ways to win and lose, and at that point, the game was playable locally. 2 players could take turns and have a fun little match. But after that, because I had created a core experience that worked and I had time left, I went on and I added some network play. So one player could be on one machine, another on another machine, and they could have a game together, sending the commands that they were choosing to execute over the network. And then once that was done, I decided I've got time left, let's polish this up. So I put the polishing after the game was actually finished. But even in its early state, even though it looks very, very unfinished, this game is completely playable at this point. And this is made with relatively few man hours. One person working on it made a completely playable game. The story is non-existent, but it doesn't need to be. The presentation is minor, but that's not the focus of this because this is simply a prototype. So it's all placeholder art, which allowed me to focus on the mechanics of the game at that early point. And once that was done, I polished it up. So by making the polishing the last step, you don't run the risk of not having a game at the end of the development time. You don't have to worry about running out of time or budget because you've got the game, and now you just make it look better. So with that, I'm going to demo the game. Here it is at the title screen. Let's click on local game because I'm only one person. Oops. Sorry about that. Let's run the game. There we go. All right, so here we are again, but now it's not just a screenshot, it's a demo. So let's queue up a few moves. Let's say I want to move this piece out here and have a very aggressive strategy. So I decide I'm going to rush that piece out and attack. Now after I've done choosing my moves, I hit execute commands, and now player 2 is going to make their moves as well. So they can maybe try to move this piece out here and this piece out here and go for a two-pronged approach. And then maybe this piece will attack as well. So they hit execute commands, and then the pieces move at the same time, and they act. After that, it's time to queue up some more moves. So you may be wondering, well, these pieces are all moving at the same time, what happens if they collide with each other? Well, that's a very good question. So let's say these pieces, we move up here, player 1 is going to, again, advance one piece, and then player 2 decides to also move that piece down here, and they had the exact same plan. They're going to move twice and then attack. Both pieces collide with each other, they can't move, and then they attack each other and they both die. So you can keep playing until the pieces are all but destroyed, or until one of the starting positions of the kings is occupied for 5 turns. So I learned a lot from this, honestly. As I said, my previous game development projects were rather small and made in only a few days, a week at most. So this has been a wonderful opportunity to explore the process more deeply and approach this as if I were in a development studio and I submitted a design document, a proposal to make the game, and then I built from that using the document as a guideline. So I've learned quite a bit about that. And as for this approach, I think it's a very good approach, and this will remove a lot of risk from game development. The only issue with this is that developers need to be accustomed to it. And the idea of throwing away a prototype may seem wasteful, but the idea of a prototype is to be something small that can be thrown away without losing valuable time and work. So in addition to that, I have learned a bit about network programming. As I mentioned, the game can be played over the network. So that was all new to me, and it was a lot more difficult than I expected, but it was a fun process for the most part. And in addition to that, I did create a game, and I think that's always a win, personally. So if you want to play the game, you can get it at this address, at my website, jacobwgames.com. And with that, are there any questions?
Were there any logical problems that you ran into, like if the opposing teams occupied the king space on the same turn, like who would win?
Yes, so as you saw, because the pieces are taking their turns at the same time, they can even attack each other and defeat each other at the same time. What happens if, for example, both king starting spaces are occupied and the timer ticks down, or all the pieces on both sides are destroyed at the same time? Well, in that case, the logic does handle that, because I realized that would be something important. So in that case, the game is considered a draw. No one wins, no one loses. Saw you first. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Are you planning on continuing to develop this? Because I noticed you still have a lot of placeholder assets and everything. So are you planning on improving on that in the future, or are you just gonna leave it as you said, prototype?
Well, as for the game right now, it is a finished product. Back here, this was very early in the development process, and then here is a recent screenshot. Here is some final art. And the game could be polished some more, I definitely agree. There are many things I would like to add, such as animations, maybe some sound effects, some more cool transitions between menus. So there's a lot more to be done if I want to make this really, really impressive. And honestly, I do, because I think there's quite a bit more I could do. For example, a mobile version I would really like to do. This would be a pretty ideal game for a phone. You could just play a quick game with your friends. The local mode would be very nice as well, because you could take your turn, pass it to a friend, they could take their turn, pass it back, etc. So yeah, I think I would.
Who is your target audience for this type of game, and how will it tend to reach?
For this type of game, well, puzzle game fans, to put it simply. The games of chess and shogi are old, but still very popular today, and I don't think that this game maybe is quite as exciting as some of those, but hopefully in 100 years, 1,000 years, people will still be playing this game. Yes?
Well, I see that the pieces are set as would a chessboard would be. However, I saw that what would be the A and H column pawns seem to move more like rooks. Are there any other differences?
Yes. So while this is inspired by chess and shogi, the pieces do move differently because it's a different game. Instead of taking turns one at a time, turns play out together. So there were some balance changes that had to be accounted for. So, for example, the rook does have a limit of 3 spaces in any of the 4 north, south, east, west directions. The pawns do move normally, more or less. And then there are a couple other differences. Knights are essentially the same. Bishops are very different. And each of these pieces, you can see, has got the highlight for where it can move, and then a highlight for how it can attack. So this bishop, while it can only move a small distance, it can attack in a very long straight line.
So at the beginning of the presentation, I think you were kind of talking about how existing game studios do things, and maybe don't do them the way you think they should. So how did you find out what they actually do? And are there any game studios that you think do sort of what you're suggesting here?
Yeah, well, as I said, I've been into game development for many years, and so along with that, I've been interested in the process that developers go through, because I've always been trying to make my own games, so I like to learn from other people. And a lot of developers, maybe not a lot, but quite a few, do postmortems of their games and say, here's what we did, here's what went right, here's what went wrong. And so from that, that's really interesting reading to me, because I can learn from their mistakes and their successes. So I see a lot of developers doing the approach I mentioned in the beginning, which I feel has maybe some merits, but is probably not the wisest choice. As for developers or studios that do something more similar to what I did, there are a lot of independent game developers that I feel do a pretty good job of this, because to them, they're a small studio, if they're a studio at all. They don't have the budget to put out huge trailers or huge marketing pushes, so there's less of a need for the incredibly cinematic content in the first place.
So it's almost a consequence of having a huge budget.
In some ways, I think so.
Can you give some examples of game studios or games that you admire?
As for studios, I think probably Ed McMullen. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, my apologies, but he's made quite a few games, mostly on his own, and then he's teamed up with people. He's produced The Binding of Isaac, which is a rather popular game, and with that, it was a similar process to this, iterating on a small concept or prototype before releasing the full game and then polishing it up. I think Nintendo as a whole is usually pretty good about this. They usually, from what I've read, develop in small cycles of prototypes before deciding on an idea and then going through with that. So I think those are some good examples.
So this is more about your game. I noticed that it has turning mechanics, like turn clockwise, turn counterclockwise. Does that like affect the overall balance of the game? Like, since the two sides are sort of adjacent to each other, is turning even necessary?
Well, yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, because these pieces are moving differently, this is a different game than chess or shogi, so there are balancing acts to be considered. So you might notice that if I want this piece to attack, it attacks in a straight line. And if I want this piece to attack, it attacks in a straight line. The queen has a little bit of a different attack. It will actually hit all the spaces in the front, left, and right. So in each case, there's no piece that does not benefit by being able to turn. Because in some cases, you may want to advance your pawn all the way up here before you turn it. Oh, I've queued up all the commands, so I'll just undo those. So advance your pawn, turn it, and then attack to free up the king's starting space. So that's another level of strategy to consider, because turning does take a full action. The king moves mostly the same, so he can move in one space in any of the 8 directions, and then he attacks only if 3 spaces in front.
Can you put the link back to your
yes.
like there's some interest?
Yeah, if you would like to try this out. Oh, I'm sorry. You're correct. My mistake. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, /games.
Yeah, jacobwgames.com. If you go there, you'll find the link to all the games well, not all the games I've made, but most of the recent games I've made. And then you can find that. It should be the very first one, in fact. Other questions?